Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, and thank you for joining this session. My name is Farzadi, and I'm a partner in PwC's deals practice, and I look after business restructuring services in the Middle East. I'm joined here by my colleague Imran Jaffer, who's the director within the business restructuring services practice, and we're going to spend the next 35 minutes or so talking about value destruction, value preservation, and value creation. The purpose of the session is to touch on a number of tools available to business owners, management teams, in order to be able to tackle and hopefully restore some of the value that may have been lost over the last few months with the impact of the pandemic and low oil, particularly in the Middle East. So the session, I'd like to just kick off the session with regards to what we call a value bridge. So it's a value preservation bridge. I think for many businesses, I suspect people would agree that COVID-19 as well as low oil has impacted value by increasing the risk of defaults and decreasing future financial outlook. In most cases, I think this has resulted, with the exception of a handful of sectors and business models, this has resulted generally in value destruction. Businesses therefore need to focus on actions and initiatives to regain control and secure future financial and operational security. This is effectively highlighted in a value preservation part of the chart that you can see. On the left-hand side, you've got the value destruction as a result of external factors. Then the middle part of the bridge is value preservation. Effectively, the focus of this session will be value in the tools available within that middle part of the chart, which is value preservation, which includes things such as liquidity management, seeking government support, rapid cost reduction, and strategic capital allocation. In terms of the key reasons and drivers and causes of value destruction, I'm not going to dwell too much on these, but we've put these effectively into three buckets: lack of liquidity, declining profitability, and strategic issues such as changing personnel or key stakeholders having disputes amongst themselves. As I said, I don't really plan to spend too much time on the drivers for value destruction, but I think it's important for us to understand the causes of any such issues to allow us to better understand and explore tools available in rebuilding value. There is an important data point that I wanted to touch on before we go into exploring the tools available to businesses, and that's PwC's recent Middle East working capital study, which has just been published. Every year we review financial performance of publicly listed businesses and companies in the Middle East to assess their working capital performance and related key indicators. We surveyed 433 publicly listed businesses this year and covered a 5-year period of 2015 through to 2019. We also looked at the data for the first and second quarters of 2020, because I think really important, in order to assess the impact of the dual shock of COVID pandemic and oil market disruptions. The key highlights coming out of the PwC working capital study is that 134 billion excess working capital appears to be trapped, in our view, on the balance sheets of Middle Eastern companies. There's limited cash on hand from the companies that we surveyed. Only 2% of the surveyed company had cash on hand of 62%. 23% deterioration we saw in the average working capital performance of the surveyed companies, which was observed in the first half of 2020. I mean, that's a drastic number. And there was average earnings before tax, so i.e. EBITDA, tax, depreciation, amortization, have declined by 4 percentage points over a 5-year period. You can download this study from the PwC website, but I thought it's a telling sign, and it's actually an important data point in terms of some of the challenges businesses are facing in the current climate, and particularly throughout 2020. It's also important to remain alert to your own specific situation. I really wanted to cover off this chart, which is effectively the corporate recovery curve we tend to use with our clients as a good indicator of control and where management have control and the options available to them in a turnaround situation. The earlier the businesses act, the more options they have available to them. And there's, of course, a point beyond which control is lost, which is demonstrated by the dotted line on this chart. Beyond this point, a business is likely to be well into crisis, and management usually tend to lose control of the process, which could then be driven and directed by external stakeholders, such as the company's creditors. The key risk we really see with this is management teams missing the warning signs that the company is heading down the curve, and therefore it is important to remain alert and assess your respective position regularly. In a business turnaround situation, it's critical to ensure that there is strategic alignment between operations and finance. In my experience, I have never seen a business go through a successful turnaround situation with only one aspect of those operations and finance being fixed. They have to go hand in hand, and both the underlying operations and also the balance sheet position of the company will need to be fixed. So you need alignment between finance and operations to ensure you achieve a successful turnaround. I want to cover very quickly at a high level some of the tools available to businesses in a value preservation journey, and my colleague Imran will go into more detail on a number of these specific areas. There are broadly 5 key areas that I want to highlight. Strategy and business review. It's important to analyze the strategic direction of your business and consider options that are available to you and to your particular circumstance. Carrying out scenario analysis and modeling for different outcomes is one way of ensuring that you have sufficient optionality when it comes to different situations. Operational restructuring is another aspect that's critical in a turnaround situation. By operational restructuring, I'm referring to rapid cash-focused cost reduction, workforce management, and implementing rapid change to reduce costs and release cash. Cash flow forecasting and liquidity management is another area that's critical and important. Developing a short-term liquidity forecast and effective working capital management, as highlighted by some of the declining trends in working capital in the Middle East, is really important to ensure there's sufficient liquidity headroom. Strategic and distressed transactions, again, are important. A review of your portfolio to establish what's core, what's non-core, both in terms of businesses and geographies, what's performing and what's not performing, and then implementing accelerated M&A transactions to exit certain businesses or geographies. And finally, negotiating with your key stakeholders. Again, assessing covenant headrooms, developing current and projected covenant compliance, and negotiating with your creditors. I will also throw into here negotiating or discussing options with your shareholders as well and with your key decision makers to ensure there's full alignment with regards to this situation. I will now hand over to Imran to cover off some more detail, some of the tools that I've just covered up at high level, and hopefully we'll be able to take some questions at the end of this session as well. Imran, over to you.
Thanks, Mo. So on the next 3 slides, I'm going to go over 3 aspects of the matrix that was just shown: putting value at the heart of operations, 5 ways of protecting cash, and then stakeholder management, which we think are some of the three of the key areas which are apparent in this cycle and this recovery more than before. I mean, the way companies have responded to previous recessions, and a lot of you will have had that experience, and the way you respond to this recession are probably different. And that is because this is an unfamiliar recession. It is an unfamiliar recession because it's a combination of a demand and a supply shock, and more importantly, there is uncertainty on the time and the type of recovery. And so the generally accepted cost reduction methodologies, functional cost reduction targets, etc., top-down cost reduction approaches, may not be ideal in this environment. And that's why in this recovery scenario, we're putting a lot more emphasis with our clients on putting value at the heart of the operational restructuring. And what do we mean by that? Well, every decision that's made, every action that's taken has to be with a focus on value creation or value preservation. It's important to be able to move very, very quickly in this environment, try new things and fail fast. If you can quickly assess whether something's working and then either disregard it or focus on it more, you will have a better chance of focusing on the real value driver. It's also important to take decisions quickly. During a lot of the current period we're in, companies have been given breathing room by their stakeholders, whether it be banks providing a little bit of headroom or providing some moratorium. During this period, if you focus on operations rapidly, when those schemes come to an end, you'll be in a position to present your actions to the banks and to your stakeholders and present your company in a better light. Essentially, you will say to the banks, we used the time you gave us in a very valuable and proactive way. If I turn to the next slide, in terms of 5 ways of protecting cash, the first one, make cash everyone's business. This is about creating a cash culture. And it's important that every function owns this and takes ownership of owning or building a cash culture. It's everyone's responsibility. Every decision that's made inside the company should go through a cash lens. And it's important that everybody in the organization understands that protecting liquidity is a top priority. Number 2, stem the flow of cash at its source. So if there are contracts, if there are commitments that are ordinary course of business type of, which are governed by ordinary course of business contracts, maybe it's time to renegotiate. Maybe it's time to go and approach your suppliers or look at your CapEx commitments again and say, we're in a new world. We don't know the type, we don't know the shape of this recovery. So let's get round the table. Involving more people in forecasting, again, this is around ownership and giving a bit of transparency to your organization so that when you're building those forecasts, you get inputs from a lot of people, and a lot of people feel like they own the cash culture. Scenario modeling. We're spending a lot of time with our clients building out various and short-term and medium-term cash flow forecasts. Scenario testing also gives management the ability to make decisions in terms of ensuring you have buffers, and if you don't have buffers, liquidity buffers, how to create them. And that really leads to the sort of last option, box, which is to explore the full range. When you understand your cash position and your outlook, then you really can spend a lot of time focusing on trapped cash, on inventory optimization, on cash pooling, and others. And it's important again that the organization that you're talking to, the people you're working with, are cash conscious, and that message permeates through the organization, that we're looking for every avenue to improve cash. If I turn to the
Imran,
last slide of my section. Yep.
Imran, just before you move on, if you just flick back to the previous slide, I just want a couple of observations before you move on to the next slide. I think this is a really important slide, and there's some key messages coming out of here that are imperative for any business in the current climate. Moving focus from P&L to cash flow is not something that can be done easily. And in many businesses are very much P&L focused rather than cash flow, historically have been. Changing that mindset in an organization is not easy, but is doable. And it's important within the current climate to ensure that we're both P&L focused to an end, but more importantly, cash focused. Because ultimately, you could be making profits on paper, but if that's not converting to cash, that's going to cause issues with your business continuity and going concern. I wanted to just touch on, some of the challenges we're seeing in the Middle East with businesses being unable to collect their receivables. And we all know that there are issues that are causing certain sectors in particular having difficulty in collecting their receivables. There are things that can be done in order to improve your receivable collections. That's really to the core of the issue, and ensuring the proper processes and procedures are in place in order to trigger the early alerts for you to take action as soon as possible. Ultimately, and this is the reality of the business or the world we live in, the one that shouts loudest does usually take priority. So for you to ensure that you're aware of which accounts are nearing to their credit limit, or which accounts are past their credit due limit, or which invoices are overdue, you just need to ensure that certain actions are taken, both by yourself, by your management teams. And if there's a necessary need to involve legal advice or otherwise, I would again highly recommend that you do that to ensure that liquidity is maintained at a level to avoid any sort of disruption to your business and business continuity. And again, we cover off some of these aspects in our working capital study, which, as I said, has been published. But it's, again, the current climate really dictates that management teams need to focus more on cash and change the priority of a business to be more cash focused than P&L focused. Imran, over back to you.
Thanks, Mo. I'm going to just go back to the curve for a second and just highlight one aspect of that, which will then lead into the last slide. If I can find it. Sorry, give me a second. Here we are. So on this, the first is to sort of really assess where you are on this curve. And as mentioned earlier, you have more options the earlier you act. So it's very important that you be alert to your situation and take early action as you can. Options will diminish. So for instance, you might have the option today of considering an M&A process. An M&A process takes time, there's diligence, there's an auction, etc. If things have gone from comfort, concern to crisis, you may not have the luxury of that time anymore. And that's just one example. There are many examples where optionality decreases as time goes on. So if I just forward back to the slide I was just about to speak to. Which is hopefully this one. Yeah, so be alert to your situation and take action before you slip into that crisis phase is, I guess, the most important thing. If you've taken action early and the value preservation mechanisms you've implemented are having a benefit, then if indeed you still end up having to restructure with your stakeholders and your banks, you'll still have more liquidity and more options than you would have had if you had taken no action, obviously, early on in terms of value preservation. The second is financial covenants, obligations, contractual obligations, and things that trigger reaction by your stakeholders need to be understood. And if you can take preemptive action to speak to your banks, speak to your stakeholders, and tell them that we foresee a covenant breach 3 or 6 months ahead of time, that will give your banks a lot more comfort that you're in control. In the middle, and as Mo said, legal and financial advisors can provide advice and an independent perspective and challenge your assumptions to make sure that you have a set of data and a package of information that when you go to your stakeholders is in a form that is robust and can be scrutinized by those stakeholders. In the fourth box, we talk about communication. This is not only communication internally, which I've mentioned before, amongst the organization, but your external stakeholders, your customers, suppliers, and your creditors. It's important to be able to take everyone on a journey and inform them early on your plans, and then deliver on those plans, and then when you come to have requests of those lenders or those stakeholders, they're not caught surprised. And then it's also important to get feedback from those stakeholders to understand what they want. They might want a 5-year business plan. They may not need a 5-year business plan, depending on your business model. They may require a 13-week cash flow forecast. They may not. So to understand what the information the stakeholders need for their own committees. And I think the last point is to understand from the lender or from a stakeholder's perspective that they're in the same position. They're facing the same outlook. You know, no one knows the speed of this recovery, and no one knows the type of this recovery. Consumer habits have changed, maybe permanently. There's been structural changes in a lot of supply chains. Lenders have a lot of concern, but they have some of the same concerns over all companies. If you can position yourself as a company to be at the top of their list in terms of companies that are on top of things, that have taken action, and that are providing transparency and have a plan, you will be at essentially the top of the list when it comes to asking for further support. That's the end of my section, Mo. Any final thoughts, please?
Yeah, no, I wanted to just focus on or put some emphasis on a couple of the things, particularly on the kind of stakeholder management and landscape space. Communication to me is the most important success factor in any kind of restructuring discussions or turnaround discussions, both internal and external communication. With regards to your external stakeholders, this becomes even more important and critical. The sooner you communicate with them with regards to a plan, whatever shape that plan might be in, the more chance you have to remain in control and to actually be able to effect a successful turnaround situation with your external stakeholders. In any sort of crisis or challenging situation, you will, most likely than not, businesses will require support from their external stakeholders, be it equity, be it your creditors, or be it some strategic investor that's looking or be meaning or wanting to come and invest in your business. Therefore, it is absolutely critical to ensure you get that communication strategy right. And to get the communication strategy right, you would need to ensure that you've got the information and the information platform that's there to be able to build your communication strategy on. What do we mean by that? We mean you need to ensure that you have your liquidity forecast in place. So if you're facing your bank and the bank says, how much time do you have before you run out of liquidity? You can point to a figure and a timeline, give them a pretty good estimate on how much liquidity remains in the business. I was involved in a situation about 3 years ago when a business and the treasurer of a business turned up with the CFO of that business to a bank meeting. I was advising the lenders in this situation, and they requested a 200 million dirham funding need that was going to crystallize within a space of 3 weeks. So he came and said, I need 200 million dirhams in order to be able to survive beyond the 3-week horizon. The banks asked PwC to review the forecast of that business, which we did, scrutinize it, challenge the assumptions, and kick the tires. And the ultimate outcome of that review by PwC and the company ultimately agreed was that actually there was no funding need. And the company was able to survive through the next 3 weeks and beyond by effectively being able to manage its suppliers a bit better, by being able to tighten its belt and collecting the cash a bit better, by deferring some of the non-critical spend, such as CapEx. What that did was that really put into question the credibility of that treasurer, and he was a senior guy in a large organization. Put into question the credibility of that treasurer because, from the first point of interacting with the company's external stakeholder, its banks, the position that was put forward to them was completely inaccurate because the homework and the detailed analysis had not been done by the company. So getting the facts right, getting the information right, ensuring that you've got everything in place to be able to go and engage with your external stakeholders is absolutely critical, and getting the messaging right as well. If we go back just quickly, flick back to the slide where we talk about the corporate curve and the demise curve. I think this is really, really important, because if you look at this slide and look at how we effectively demonstrate where options are and where control exists, that kind of comfort, concern, crisis, and catastrophe, if you look on the left-hand side, from comfort to crisis, things could unravel pretty quickly. This could be a matter of days, if not, days or even a week or two, where you could go from comfort to crisis. And therefore, your options are continuing to narrow down as you go down that kind of curve. And then there is a point where control is lost to external stakeholders. So again, being alert to your own specific situation, assessing and reassessing the position with regards to your own situation, be it liquidity, be it business planning, be it scenario analysis, is absolutely critical in order to ensure that you remain in control. And remaining in control, in my view, is a key success factor for businesses that are wanting to go through a turnaround situation. With both operations and financial going hand in hand. So I think we wanted to cover that very quickly with regards to some of the tools available to businesses in value preservation and value rebuild. We wanted to leave at least 5 minutes or so for some questions. So if the audience have any questions that they want myself and Imran to cover, please, now's the opportunity. I believe you can ask your questions via the chat box, and Imran and I will do our best to answer them. Okay, so there's a question coming in, and I will just set the question and then try and answer it. So while no one gets a good idea of how the COVID situation may affect industries in the near future, for instance, the travel industry, how one builds scenario analysis of the business and give probability to each scenario? And that's a very good question, and it's one that is art rather than a science. I think, and we've done this on a number of client situations. Building scenario analysis doesn't mean that you have to get the forecast, have to get the position right. Scenarios are exactly what they are. The scenarios and the forecast, and by virtue of the fact that they are forward-looking, they will be inaccurate. The best a business can do to set out a number of different scenarios. So you would range as a minimum a base case, a low case, and a high case. Now, if the question is, how do I know what my base case is or what my low case and high case, I think you'll be the best judge of that. You would set based on fact in hand at the point of the time, based on market data that's available in the travel industry or otherwise, and set your base case based on what you think would be the likely outcome in the future. Then you'd apply your effectively low and high case, which then should give you a range within which there's likely and range of outcomes that could be presented internally or to your stakeholders. Now, no one can suggest that this is going to be accurate, and in order to be able to arrive at that range and even your base case, I would recommend using externally available market data, industry publishings by either firms like ours or other kind of research firms to allow you to be able to come up with that kind of range of likely outcomes within your specific sector. There is a question for which I don't think I'll be able to give an answer. If I could, then I think I would be very rich and I would not be presenting this session, and I'll be betting either for or against. The question is, what's the LIBOR rate? What LIBOR rate do you think will go up to? So what would the LIBOR rate be next year? I'm not an economist, and nor do I have a crystal ball, so I'm not going to be able to answer that question. But I think it's one that to look out for. The indicators would suggest that the movement should not be material. But again, I don't have a crystal ball to be able to answer that, and it'd be very wealthy if I was, if I did have an answer to that question.
But I think a good follow-on to that question is, if you have floating rate debt and you have seen quantitative easing and other policies around the world create a negative mark to market in your swaps, in your hedges, those can become quite difficult in a restructuring, and they shouldn't be underestimated, because while they are not crystallized, at the point of negotiation with your stakeholders, with your banks, some of whom might be your hedge counterparties, those banks, will have essentially two competing interests. Their interest under the loan, which they might be in a syndicate with other banks, and then they'll have their interest under the mark to market. So from a hedging and exposure perspective, it's not to be underestimated in the environment we're in.
Thanks, Imran. I'm not seeing any more questions come through, so we've got just short of 2 more minutes of the session remaining. So I think we'll give it another minute or so to see if there's any additional questions. Otherwise, we can wrap up. Any final questions before we close the session? Okay, excellent. I don't see any other questions coming through, Imran. I don't know if your screen, you see any further questions coming from the audience. Otherwise, otherwise, thank you very much for the opportunity. Hope that you at least were able to take maybe 1 or 2 pointers of things that could be helpful for your business. Please, you've got our contact details. Be in touch if you want to explore anything further, or you've got any other questions offline. Thank you.